Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Jobs Foundation webinar on basically hiring, training, employing ex-offenders. I'm going to start by just putting this work in the webinar in context, a little bit about what the Jobs Foundation is doing and why we're holding this event. So last year, the Jobs Foundation released our foundational research. It was a report entitled 2 Million Jobs. And the title was about the stated Labour Party ambition that they said before the election of creating that many new jobs. Of course, as it stands, the job market has around 800,000 vacancies, give or take. So we need to find the new talent somewhere, and we also need employers to create new jobs, essentially. So following on from that in 2025, we are traveling around the country again, speaking to organizations large and small about more specifically best practice in terms of hiring, training, and retaining staff. One of the ways that we're doing that is we're looking at specific cohorts of employees and potential employees, and one of them is hiring ex-offenders. So we, I don't want to do too much intro on that particular thing because we have an absolutely stellar panel who will talk at much more length and expertise than I can do, and so we'll get into. I mean, the one thing to say is obviously the transition from particularly a custodial sentence to the workplace can be daunting for a lot of people, for most people, really, and that's before we get into the immense barriers that obviously exist for ex-offenders. So we've got a great panel to discuss that today. We've got Darren Burns, who's the Director of Diversity Inclusion at the Timson Group. Darren has been at Timson for over 13 years, leading on their recruitment for much of that time. And obviously, as anyone I'm sure who's here will know, Timson Group is one of the leading employers of ex-offenders in the UK. But joining us as well is Steve Freer, the co-founder and CEO of Tempus Novo. Steve has worked in the criminal justice system for decades, starting at HMP Wormwood Scrubs. He worked with some of the most notorious criminals in the UK, and since then he has led on several ex-offender rehabilitation initiatives in prisons across the north of England. And of course, Colin Crooks, MBE. Colin is an award-winning social enterprise entrepreneur. In 2012, he used his experience of employing more than 1,000 hard-to-employ people to write How to Make a Million Jobs. And as Colin joked at the launch of 2 Million Jobs, we doubled what his ambition of.
Yeah, you trumped me.
Colin was awarded the MBE in 2019 New Year's Honors List for services to disadvantaged people and the environment. So. I'm going to start with you, Darren. What are some of the challenges in terms of hiring, training, and retaining ex-offenders as employees? And what do employers such as yourself, who do so much work in this area, do to overcome those challenges?
Great question, Nick. So for us, it sounds awfully conceited of us, but because we've been doing this now for such a long time, or we've got so much experience, it's kind of second nature to us now. So hiring ex-offenders and retaining them and looking after them is kind of embedded within our culture. But I think an interesting way to answer the question was to go back in time when we started doing this over 20 years ago. And I think the first kind of issue that we come across was the attitudes of our existing colleagues. So obviously when our former CEO decided to employ prison leavers and people with convictions, he kind of announced it to the whole business. And when he did, lots of people thought he'd gone mad. He thought that these people are going to be inherently dangerous, dishonest, chaotic. It's going to cause great reputational damage. And obviously all that turned out not to be true, thankfully. But the reason that we sort of got our colleagues on board and we took them along with us in this ex-offender employment journey is because we learned from our mistakes. And we quickly realised that quite sadly, really, probably only about a third of the prison population are what we would consider to be work ready. The other 2/3 of people in custody have got lots of complex needs and issues surrounding diagnosed mental health conditions, addiction problems, homelessness, physical ailments, or a combination of all four. And whilst obviously we don't want to consign those sort of large group of the prison population to the employment scrap heap, we're not the experts. So that's where the state effectively should look to help these people in terms of trauma-informed therapy, abstinence-based recovery, and only when these people reach a certain level of being employment ready and job ready should they be put in front of employees or be introduced to people like Steve or people like Colin And at that point, then, when we meet these people, they're prepared to make positive changes to their lives. When they come on, we can give them all that support. I think the other challenges that we faced over the years is that we were possibly too trusting at the very early stages. Now we've gotten very good at sort of meeting people and trying to establish if they're work ready, if they can fulfill our risk criteria. And once we've identified that, we give them all the support and flexibility. And I think support and flexibility is absolutely key. You mentioned before, when people get released from custody, that transition through the prison gates into society can often be more traumatic and disturbing than going in there in the first place. What we did, I'm kind of ashamed to admit, really, in the very early stages of our ex-offender employment journey, was that we treated everybody the same. And we were quite proud of that. So when somebody would leave custody and join the Timpson group, we would say, listen, we're not going to give you any special treatment. We're going to treat you the same as all of our colleagues. And if you mess up, we're going to fire you. We're going to dismiss you pretty much straight away. We don't do that now. We're a lot more kind of tuned into people's specific needs, particularly when they've been released from custody. So that might manifest in some very early on bumps in the road. It might be some absenteeism. It might be some lateness. And rather than sort of pull that trigger straight away and dismiss somebody, instead we'll have a chat with them. We'll find out if they're okay. We'll introduce them to one of our mentors. We'll give them some advice and guidance, and we'll build in that sort of flexibility. But again, just qualify that with saying that we're not a soft touch. First and foremost, we are a commercial business, and without this being a kind of a commercial arrangement for us, which works, we wouldn't be able to sustain it. So it is transactional. Ultimately, prison leavers, people with convictions, they've got to come out. They've got to pull the weight. They've got to deliver first-class customer service. They've got to put money in our tills. And if that can't happen, despite us giving people sort of chances to improve, giving people support and guidance and help, then ultimately we will part company with people. But we now build in that flexibility.
Wonderful. Steve, I'm going to bring you in here. Tell me a bit about the Tempus Novo approach to working with ex-offenders, and you can get into the history and anything you like, really, just anything about how you guys approach this subject.
Yeah, sure. So really, Tempus Novo exists partly because of Timpson's, if we're honest. When I was working in prisons, I had the good fortune to work with Darren's predecessor, actually. And I noticed that this, not only is it something that can work, it's something that has to work, because I think currently it's costing us £18.1 billion a year, the taxpayer, reoffending alone. Not a good business model. People going out and reoffending. We need to be looking at different options, and the best one is by far a job. Yes, there's other support elements required, housing, family, if they're lucky enough to have a family, the people. But one of the things that we did right at the beginning was we sort of changed the narrative really around ex-prisoners and prisoners and offenders and criminals, whatever you want to call them. Because the general public think they're all monsters. And that's furthest thing from the truth. There's a tiny, tiny percentage of what I'd call really bad, evil people in prison. Thankfully, it is a tiny percentage. Then you have to go a stage further and think, what level of risk as an employer would I be prepared to work with? And there's certain type of offenders who people might not want to say that they wouldn't work with, but we know they wouldn't. So we make that difficult decision for them. So we don't work with sex offenders. We don't work with murderers, terrorists, and anybody connected to arson because of insurance costs to employers. But it's not just as simple as putting a well-risk assessed ex-offender with a forward-thinking employer that's prepared to give people a chance. And it is in a lot of cases, it's a first chance, because a third of people in prison have come through the care system and had a horrendous start to life, which ironically is one of the things that makes them so loyal and grateful and hardworking when they get the chance, actually, because they don't expect it. But when you've put them together, you need to support them. Darren touched on it. It has to be bespoke, personal support for that individual. That comes at a cost. Now, we've, as an organisation, really pushed the boat out and worked hard to ensure that we can meet those costs. Because if we'd have done what for example, probation and government do, it wouldn't have worked. This isn't a program that can be done how big and how cheap. This is about people and people's lives and sustainability. Again, Darren said, it's no point taking people on that are going to last 2 minutes. That's not a good business model for anybody. You want people that are going to stay with you for the long term and appreciate the chance. We've now placed over 1,250 people into what I call caring, ethical businesses. And that matters. We do a lot of due diligence on the businesses that we work with because they're not all in it for the right reasons. Those who are, it's a win-win. In fact, the wins are incredible because by adopting this approach, not only are you reducing crime, reducing victims, there's less people on benefits, more people paying tax and insurance, safer streets, more prosperous communities, intergenerational change, because then you've got great role models for children within the families. It's just like, why wouldn't you do this? Providing it's done in a very safe and by experts, by the way. Not just anybody can do this work. You need to understand, because you need to be able to navigate the criminal justice system. That in itself is extremely difficult. And if you understand that world, it makes it a little bit easier. So where we are now, we're looking at scaling. I mean, as I said, 1,200. We're probably putting 250 people a year into work at the minute. We're hoping to scale that. We've got a pilot project starting with the Police and Crime Commissioner in Cheshire in autumn, where we'll be placing 100 people per year with the support and funding from the PCC. We're hoping to then hopefully copy and scale that around the country, because if we can put 1,000 people per year into employment, who otherwise arguably half of them at least would be reoffending, the savings to the economy are staggering. It's £51,000 to keep somebody in prison for 12 months. Then there's the benefits, the housing benefits. It's staggering cost to the taxpayer. And instead of that person being a burden on society, they're actually becoming a productive member of society. So when we were putting this model together, there were just so many wins. It were like, it's a no-brainer. Again, providing it's done properly.
Got you. Okay. Colin, you have worked with loads of different types of disadvantaged people from all sorts of different, categories of disadvantage, if you like. What would you say in your experience is what's unique, if you like, in terms of the challenge of employing ex-offenders?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to join this august panel on this podcast. I think Jobs Foundation is doing really fantastic work to highlight this issue. Of course, my experience goes back a little bit, and I'm now a coach, a business coach, and I support businesses in many ways, but one way in particular about how do you broaden your recruitment, particularly to more disadvantaged members of the population, and including ex-offenders. But my experience at the time of employing offenders as opposed to other people from disadvantaged backgrounds, say for a long-term unemployment or drug addiction or something like that, or homeless backgrounds, was that the prison environment had institutionalized them. So I would agree with absolutely everything that Darren and Steve have said. And the only thing I would add to that is this institutionalization. We were taking people that were serving in excess of 5 years. So they had been inside for a good chunk of time, and some of them had offended previously. So they had a cumulative amount of years in prison. And so to get them to trust or to really believe that this was different, that this was an opportunity as opposed to another place where they've got to game the system, was the first hurdle. This is a real potential for you. You could thrive here. You can express yourself. You can learn new skills, and it's up to you. And it will benefit you. You will get paid for this work. That was probably the biggest single challenge for a lot of the people we worked with. These were people who were being released on temporary license, so they were still in prison. So they were going back to the cells after a very long day, being strip searched, They were the other problem was they were undernourished.
Mm. That's interesting. Right.
They were to get out. If you have to imagine, so the people that would the tube journey. We were based in London, was over an hour and a half from the prison to where we were operating. So they're being released at 6 o'clock in the morning, having been strip searched. So that's getting up at 4:30, 5 o'clock. No breakfast.
Mm.
You've
Wow.
got a travel allowance, but with very little budget for food. You can't really stop off because you haven't got time. In the evening, it would leave us at 5 o'clock. They get back after dinner is served. By the time they've got through security, been strip searched, etc., etc., and they may have a cold meal that somebody has kept for them. They may not. So they were hungry when they came to us. They were excited. They, it was out of the prison. They had an opportunity, but there was a number of issues around the institutionalization in both those regards that were initially something we had to overcome with them. So we had breakfast ready for them when they came in.
Interesting.
That sort of stuff.
Right.
Sort of really basic mechanics.
Hmm.
The other big issue is that their domestic life bleeds in. I mean, this does apply to a lot of disadvantaged groups, but their domestic life bleeds into their life at work. So relations follow them, literally come to the workplace to try and get money off them. They have situations at home where they're being bullied into paying money, because they're probably often, if they have got this job with us and they have been released and they're now going home, they are the only breadwinner.
Hmm.
People start to leech off them. So there was all sorts of external factors that we weren't able to manage, and we needed support from probation to help us with those. And I think that's probably the biggest single area where we could improve the process, is that external support for the situation that these people are emerging into as they come out of prison.
Right, got you. Steve, I want to come back to you just after what Colin said, which is very interesting about, some of the institutional issues that immediately sort of present to you when you're trying to employ ex-offenders. And just picking up on something you said about, the difficulty of navigating the criminal justice system. Can you get into some detail about that? Just
Yeah, sure.
some of the big challenges there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's pretty commonly known that the prison service and the probation service are underfunded dreadfully at the moment. I think in Kent at the moment, they've only got about 50% of the probation officers that they need to cope. And there's other pressures. We know that the prisons are bursting at the seams at the moment. I heard last week that they may be putting people into police cells, which hasn't happened for 25 years to my knowledge. So they're not in a good place. And until people are serious about the level of funding and training and standards that are required across the board, you're not going to see a lot of change, unfortunately, not positive change. I mean, we take place of the probation Tempus Nova. Our staff are trained to such a degree that they can support them, liaising with their probation teams. And we've just taken on an ex-offender, actually, a guy who's just finished a 15-year sentence, and he's struggling big time to reintegrate because, like Colin said, the institutionalization, it's a big issue. Simple things to us are very, very difficult to somebody that's just come out of prison especially after a big sentence like that. But when you've got that mentor, coach, friend, and again, Colin made a really good point, because trust is everything in this world. They've been in a world where it's a lack of trust, if we're honest. They're up against it. They're up against the system, the establishment, whatever you want to call it. To break down those barriers and gain the trust is the first thing that you have to do. And our staff are excellent at that. And then you can navigate the other bits. But the criminal justice system itself is in a really bad place. There's no getting away from it. And until we address that, these issues are going to continue, sadly. You know, the idea of building more prisons, surely they should be supporting more organisations like ours to reduce the prison population, as opposed to just building more prisons at a huge cost to the taxpayer.
Darren, just bringing you in on that point, in terms of some of the, the additional pressure that the criminal justice system has been under over the past decade, have you found that Timpson has had to adjust to that? And if so, how have you managed that?
To be honest with you, it's been quite difficult. We've got quite a good reputation within the criminal justice system, obviously, because we've been doing it for such a long time, same as Steve and the same as Colin. But it can be quite difficult for us for all the reasons that Steve's mentioned. Prison officers generally, in my opinion, aren't paid enough. They aren't respected enough. It's such an important job. And often the kind of operational responsibilities in a prison can get in the way of rehabilitation. So there are lots of great prison governors, lots of great prison officers who know that rehabilitation through employment is the way forward. But unfortunately, because they're so understaffed and they're so underfunded, it can be quite difficult for them to make that a priority. We've managed. What we try and do is we try and identify prisons which have got a very forward-thinking governor, people who believe in rehabilitation, people who are prepared to work with us, and people like Colin and people like Steve, and we put all of our efforts in that. In some respects, I think the employability for prisoners has improved over the years. I've been in this job now with Timpson for about 14 years, and I can honestly say it's probably the best time now to be released from custody if you're trying to find employment. With the inception of the employment advisory boards, the work that's done with the New Futures Network, people like Steve, people like Colin, there's lots of opportunities out there now, so much so that we've made it quite difficult for ourselves. When I started my job in Timpson, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I could pretty much go to any prison and have the pick of all the best candidates. Now, when we turn up, often people have been made other offers by other employers. People have been connected to people like Colin, people like Steve through Tempest Novo. So they've quite frankly got more opportunity now, which is bad for us, but it's good for us overall. But we shouldn't be complacent. There's still so much more to be done. And as Steve mentioned before, there's 14 million people in the UK with a conviction more serious than a driving offence. So there's still sort of millions of people, thousands of people who face sort of stigma in terms of employment. So we need to be doing more to get these people back into employment, so they're not a drain to the system.
Colin, in terms of, we've touched on a lot of issues around the criminal justice system and just the system in terms of getting people with criminal records back into work. If you could if you were speaking to the government, is there one policy above all, or maybe one or two, that you would recommend that would make life easier for people who want to employ ex-offenders?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while, as you know. And I think actually what we need is what I'd call something like an approved employer status. And an approved employer would be one that's gone through the hoops that Steve and Darren have gone through, that they understand exactly what's required, they provide the extra mentorship, they have a workforce that's familiar with working with ex-offenders and the issues that they have. And the benefits of being an approved provider would be that they would have better access to risk assessment data from the prison. At the moment, you don't, as an employer, you're not told what the circumstances of that person's imprisonment is. You have an idea of the offence, so you can make a judgment at that, but that's very crude, really. It's not much more than that. You have no idea about whether there's a gang involvement or whatever else is going on. So in terms of conducting a risk assessment about where you employ these people and whether they should be public facing or not, and all those sorts of things, and what postcode you should employ them in, really difficult, really challenging. That came up in one of your discussions just a few weeks ago, and it certainly affected us at the time. So an approved employer would have access to a bit more information, not the whole thing, I think, but also, I think, Darren and Steve have alluded to this, the supervision costs are higher, particularly for the first 3 to 6 months. You have to deinstitutionalize these people, build the trust, give them productive work, manage slightly enhanced absence. They've got to register for doctors, dentists, all these things. They've got to, go to the local authority. They've got to get to be able to vote. There's all sorts of things that they need to take time off for genuinely. And then there's all the sort of domestic environment stuff that I referred to earlier on. And that adjustment from a release to coming into the civilian world is quite challenging. It's extremely challenging, I think. So I think that the approved employer would have access to information and a bit of funding to provide this extra supervision and compensation for lost hours whilst they work through the system. I don't think it's a vast amount of money, and in comparison to the funds that Steve is talking about in terms of the cost of imprisonment and the ongoing costs of recidivism, it's pennies. But it would really help if we could just have these. And then, of course, if you're an approved employer, you could become the sort of conduit, if you like, because I think what we need to be doing is moving these people through. Some of them, obviously, loyalty is one of the great attributes of working with offenders, and it's something that I valued hugely. But we were also looking to move them on into other jobs so that we could take more on the next batch of people being released. So if we were an improved employer, we could perhaps be part of that pipeline, if you like.
Got you. I'm going to start bringing in questions from the audience because I really like to get to anything that comes up from them. Please do post any questions that you have, and I'm very happy to put them to our panel. So I've got one from Amy Walton, who is saying, at our local council, we're exploring working with certain organizations to become part of the prison employer engagement scheme. As a question to the panel, what innovative ideas are you using in your areas? So yeah, anybody who wants to jump in there, that would be great. Innovative schemes, innovative ideas.
I'll try and answer that one, Nick, if I can. So for us, it probably was quite new and fresh and sort of exciting thinking 20 odd years ago, but for now it really is embedded within our culture. Right. So for us, particularly with the labour market being so buoyant after kind of the perfect storm of Brexit and the pandemic, it didn't make any sense to not consider prison leavers or people with convictions. So as I mentioned before, there are so many people with convictions in the UK. And I think 70% of employers openly admit to discriminating against people with convictions. So for us, because we don't do that, we've had the benefits. So as I said, particularly after the pandemic, when recruitment was difficult, we had that really credible recruitment stream of prison leavers, people with convictions that we could tap into, and it was effectively a huge pool of untapped talent. So people would see that as innovative and fresh. For us, it was at the time. But now we've completely normalised it and embedded it within our culture. But I mean, I often say that people can't really consider themselves to be inclusive employers if they're not considering employing people with convictions. And again, I think Steve touched on it earlier. Lots of people in custody have got lots of barriers to employment. They're often care experienced, they're often military veterans, they're often neurodiverse. So you're helping all these other marginalised groups just by helping prison leavers and people with convictions.
Great. Okay. So,
yeah, could I just jump in on?
Yeah, please, Colin, please do.
So I think one of the really innovative things we can all do as employers, and picking up on Darren's point, this is good for all new starters, is actually to not necessarily define the role so tightly. What we actually found was very successful was to employ somebody in a particular role to get them started, relatively accessible work that they could conceivably understand. We have this sort of principle called what I call ACT. So it's an accessible work that they can understand from day one. It's work that they can complete in a day, so they can see a beginning, a middle, and an end. So they've got this great sense of job satisfaction and job done. But it's got to be done in a team. So that's the T of ACT. That they've got to feel needed, that the bit they're doing, other people are relying on them to do it, and there's something that is a sort of holistic whole. But the innovation that we then added on to that was to circulate them around the warehouse. So we offered them 2-week placement in customer service, in marketing, in delivery, in warehouse functions, in HR, whatever. And one lady, I made a quite a big mistake looking back on it and listening to Steve. I did employ an arsonist. I ran a furniture factory and I employed an arsonist who'd been in prison for 5 years. So it was a very serious fire. She wanted to become an administrator. She trained as an administrator and with typing skills in prison. And within 3 weeks realised that wasn't for her. It wasn't the job she wanted. And she became a great success on her warehouse shop floor. Now, she didn't know that. We couldn't have conceived that. But this flexibility of being able to go around, if you've been in prison for quite a long time, you have really no idea what the world of work is. So the idea that you know what job you want and that you'd work in this particular area is probably pie in the sky. So the idea that, an innovation I would say is to work with employers that can give that variety of options.
Right. Okay. I've got another question from the audience. It's a great one, actually. Employers we speak to often raise a fear of employing prison leavers with violent offences. How do you respond to questions like these? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that.
Thanks. Yep.
That's a fact. I think possibly up to 20-25% of crimes violent right across the board. But take them out of that environment. There's no need to be violent. They're violent for a reason. They're involved in drug dealing and gangs. These are the people we work with want to change their lives. We don't drag them kicking and screaming to work.
Yeah.
They're ready. Not everybody's ready in custody currently, but there's always a churn of people each week, each month, each year who suddenly something clicks. And it could be, and the prisoners have told me themselves on the landings, if I go in front of that judge again, it's double figures. I need to get my act together. And one of the things I need is a job, because without a job, I have to offend to put food on the table. So, yeah, the people that we work with, they're ready. They want that change, and it has to be like that, because otherwise it just couldn't work. They've got to be motivated to want to change, to become a productive member of any employment sector.
Yeah.
Can I just comment on that one as well, Nick, please?
Please, yeah, Darren, I'd welcome. Go on.
Yeah, so in terms of people convicted of violent offences, it's not an issue for us. I think that the biggest trap people fall into who aren't used to employing people with convictions is that they use really broad brush strokes to think of offences. In reality, it's quite nuanced. Whenever we employ somebody from prison or somebody with a conviction, we sit down with them and we have an honest and frank discussion about the circumstances surrounding their offence and about aggravating factors as well. The fact is that Steve's quite right. Once you take people out of that particular environment and you give them gainful employment, often it just takes them out of that situation completely. But in reality, any one of us sort of decent tax-paying, hard-working people who've never been in trouble with the police before can find themselves the wrong side of the gates. It's very easy to get drawn into a situation. I've got hundreds of examples whereby these quote-unquote decent people have just found themselves in a particular situation. So for us, I think it's a danger to sort of write people off who've got those sort of offences. So, for example, we've got 60 lifers working for us, or people who've committed murder. But again, we're really careful about the sort of people we choose. So if the offence has been deemed to be premeditated, if there's lots of aggravating factors, if it was a race hate job or a homophobic incident or something like that, then it would be a no. Now, there's no such thing as a good murder, obviously. But there's certainly situations whereby it's a lot more kind of palatable and acceptable than others. And again, we've got lots of examples. I probably spend about 80% of my time helping other businesses to recruit from this cohort. And there are just so many examples whereby people who've never had any intention of hurting anyone or breaking the law or going to prison have just kind of been embroiled in a situation. And unfortunately, that's they've ended up in prison as a result. So it can be done. And I think that the kind of fixation with risk, whilst it's understandable to an extent, Steve and Colin will tell you that the majority of people in the UK are going to be released at some point. And you've got to ask yourself the question, what sort of people do we want released back into our communities? People who've been rehabilitated, people who've got an opportunity through employment, or people who've been institutionalised and just kicked out without a second chance.
Right.
Yeah, I second everything the two of you have just said. most people are going to be released. Society, it's incumbent on society to help these people become more productive. And I think it's all about that, going back to that supervision, going back to creating a good workplace. If people, most of these crimes of violence are situational, not all, but most. And if actually you create a really positive situation at work where people are properly supervised, given proper work with, a real sense of being needed and completing something, I think these risks evaporate.
Yeah. We've got now HR teams who will willingly and openly say that working with ex-offenders is the best part of their job. I've got tons of emails because we're all human beings at the end of the day, and it's an incredible feeling when you can help somebody out of a bad place. I'm sure we've all done it in our lives at some time. It's no different with ex-offenders. They're in a bad place. They've been pretty much shunned by society. For them to get a good job without a Colin, a Darren, a Timpsons, a Tempest Novo is bordering on impossible, trust me. And I hate using that word because I like to think there's a way around everything. But having that stigma, that conviction, honestly, it's bordering on impossible getting a job without that broker to help you.
Well, so I've got on that point, it perfectly brings in what will be my final question. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask this and then ask anybody who jumps in to kind of just bear in mind that this will probably be final words on during this podcast. So Darren initially mentioned that colleagues were skeptical of working with ex-offenders before this began at Timpsons. What do the panel think are the best ways to change public attitudes towards working with ex-offenders? And obviously, since you were mentioned there, Darren, I'll bring you in first, if that's okay.
People just need to be educated. Again, I think it's mentioned before, people jump to the most extreme conclusions. So if you ask somebody to describe a prisoner, they will say heavily tattooed thug, 6'4", can't string a sentence together, nothing to offer. In reality, it's people like everybody on this panel. During the course of my career in Timpson, I've met, interviewed, and ultimately employed people from prison who are former senior police officers, judges, doctors, airline pilots, financial directors, you name it. We've sort of encountered all these people in there. So for me, it's just an education piece. I think you've got to be honest. There are people in prison who, quite frankly, are dangerous and need to be in prison. There are lots of people in prison who, quite sadly, aren't employment ready for some of the reasons that we mentioned earlier regarding mental health, addiction, physical ailments. But that still leaves thousands of people in custody who just need that opportunity. We need to just get rid of that stigma and just focus on people's potential and stop fixating on the sort of previous indiscretions. So ultimately, prisons are full of people who've done bad things, not bad people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great point that you make there, because the narrative really around this is everything. People only understand what they see and hear from the media, the press, the TV, because understandably, the majority of the public haven't been near or in a prison. But the reality is so far from that, honestly. It needs turning on its head. I think 50 to 60% of people in prison come from poverty and have never had a chance. Never mind a second chance. Let's be human about this. And like Darren says, yes, there are people in prison that deserve to stay there. I'm certainly not soft on crime. I were at Armley not long after they stopped hanging them at Leeds prison. Far from soft on crime. But you've got to, like Colin says, you've got to be sensible and run as a business and not have your political views having the final say. These are human beings that, given a chance, can be some of the best workers that you've ever seen, and I've got the evidence of that.
Right. Colin, your thoughts and any other thoughts you want to add in at the end here?
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. I just want to say thank you to Amy for her suggestion about the local skills improvement plans. That's really appreciated. And I'll try and weave in an answer to your other question, Amy, into my final comments. I think that we really got the way of overcoming this is actually to look at it from a much more asset-based opinion. Instead of what we're currently doing, we're talking about people who have committed an offence. Actually, we should be talking about people who've got a skill, who've got abilities, they've got capabilities. So literally reframe the whole thing. Here we have an institution that's full of people who've got this number of skills and trades and opportunities and possibilities. And instead of saying that these are all thieves and arsonists or whatever else, I mean, of course they're that as well, but we've got to overcome that. There's an enormous amount of skill and ability within those four walls. And I think that's the approach, Amy, that we should take to those drug dealers that are saying that they can earn so much more money trading. What they can't get is a sense of proper teamwork and loyalty. They're in a very dangerous world of very little loyalty. And if they want to have a fuller life, possibly less money, but possibly not, then they should look to gainful employment. Perhaps self-employment, because that's something we haven't talked about yet. But for those offenders that, we have said that we wouldn't employ, the list that Steve gave, actually the only route for them is to start their own business.
Right, that's interesting. The entrepreneurial bit. That's yeah, very interesting.
Which is work I did in my last social enterprise, helping people start their own business because they frankly can't get a job. It'd be very difficult.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting point to end on. Just, yeah, entrepreneurship, encouraging entrepreneurship amongst ex-offenders. Yeah, Steve, any quick thoughts?
Yes, the people that we come across, there aren't many that I've come across personally that either want to or are capable of running their own business. I mean, it is a big risk. Obviously, we know that statistically, but there has to be something for them, and I think that is certainly an option. I have seen success cases over the years, of course. It's just that they are few and far between. It's just the narrative is so important around this, and at the moment we've got it wrong. Simple. It's got to change, but it's not politically popular. We understand there's not much money around, and if you're competing with healthcare, education, police, unfortunately, crime and criminals come right at the bottom. So I get it, but the more people like us, we can drive the change. And I think to be fair, we have done over the years. I think we're seeing more and more opportunities now for people with convictions getting some good jobs.
Great. And on that note, I will end the session. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you particularly to everyone who offered a question. That was very helpful. Thank you very much for that. And of course, huge thanks to our incredible panel. This was we couldn't have got a better possible panel, I think, for this. Having Timpson, Tempus Novo, and Colin, that's absolutely great. So thank you to Steve, thank you to Darren, thank you to Colin. And again, thank you to everyone who joined us. I just quickly like to say, wrapping up on our best practice report, which is leading into our accreditation scheme in early 2026. Please get in touch if you have any businesses that you think might be interesting for us to speak to. Obviously, we're covering ex-offenders, but we're also looking at veterans. We're also looking at homeless. We're also looking at young people. Generally, we're looking at people who make a special note of hiring locally. So if you have any interesting businesses, please get in touch. I think the best place to get in touch is info@thejobsfoundation.com. But you can find all that on our website. So please go to our website, The Jobs Foundation, www.thejobsfoundation.com. And thank you guys for joining us. And please, we'll have lots of interesting webinars coming up and lots of interesting work. Please get involved. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Yep. Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Center.